Hi, I'm Jeff Lowe, Chief Executive Officer of Asian Sky Group, Asian Sky Media. And I'm very happy to have on the line, on the call with me today for his second appearance, but it's been 5 years, Ziva Narendra from Aviatory, Indonesia. As we were just talking before we got started, it's going to be very interesting to see Ziva's comments. Because, like I said, we had him on 5 years ago. We ran through what the issues were for not only Indonesia, but also for the Asia-Pacific region when it came to, shall we say, the area of aviation education, because it's not just pilots, it's mechanics, it's a whole bunch of other things. So it'll be interesting to pick your brain now, because as you and I were saying, a lot has happened in those 5 years since, and it's very much a different environment today. But you may very well tell me the problems are just the same as they were before. So I guess let's not waste any more time and get stuck in, if you will. And certainly the first question is exactly that, what challenges do the industry face at the moment? And that would be certainly in Indonesia, which is one of the biggest markets in the Asia-Pacific region. And also then your views on the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. But starting with Indonesia, previously, comments were that shortage, not enough training schools, a lot of pilots were graduating, but it was a quantity over quality issue. And certainly, you had almost commented also that there wasn't the consistency one training school to the next. And so there seemed to be some issues as far as making sure that the product that did come out of those training schools was the same no matter where they went. Even though, as you said, everyone has the same rules and regulations, we weren't just seeing a consistent product, if you will, coming out of those training schools. So if you take a look at the issues today, what do you see, Ziva?
Yeah. Thanks again for having me today, Jeffrey, and everyone at ASG. I know it has been 5 years. I think it was Italia, to whom I submitted the training report back then. And then also a general scope of review in 2018. I believe it was a charter reporter also within the line of training. But to answer your question, things really have not changed much since then, pandemic aside, in terms of how the training education is being executed or being done here. Of course, the economy has a lot to do with that. But even prior to the pandemic, which is late 2019, early 2020, we actually saw a much less population of training schools, pilot schools, or education institutions being around Indonesia, in comparison with in 2016. Back then, we had, when I submitted the report, we still had between 13 to 17 local pilot training schools in Indonesia spread across the archipelago. And at the end of 2019, that number shrunk down to 7 active flying schools, simply because the airlines weren't recruiting at the time, especially for fresh graduate and ab initio pilots. As you recall,
you had said before
at a record high.
You'd said before, it's always a question of experience as well. So the green guys, if you've got something else to choose from, they're the last ones that are going to be selected. So
exactly, even the ones that actually have secured employment or currently working were actually at that time were already facing furloughs because the airlines were making enough utilization and making enough money, and then COVID came. And, producing or training new generation of pilots seems to be the least a priority at the time to this day. But has things changed? Have things changed in the way that the training curriculum's been done, and also on the perspective of the qualifications and the quantity over quality perspective?
As you said, you've gone from 13 to 17 down to 7. You'd like to think the best survived, okay? But maybe it's not the case.
Exactly. And I said the strongest survive. But in the end, if you're fulfilling or the intention is to fulfill the quantitative demand of the industry, let's say if airline X requires 50 pilots over the spread of the next quarter or so, that would necessitate you to speed up your program in order to meet that demand. But would those demand also entail the qualification side of it? Because sometimes if you get into an airline direct entry, you're not only talking about the basic certifications or licenses. You're also talking about type ratings and advanced trainings and so on and so forth. The list goes on. So if you're only simply trying to meet the quantitative demand, in the long run, I see that you're still falling short from the qualitative side once the economy settles through and balance out. Right. So I see this problem still being existing.
So, I mean, and again, I'll just add, I know you guys are active in a lot of other areas, and we're kind of beating you up on training, if you will. But I mean, how do you think it's going to play out over the next few years then? I mean, we've got a pandemic, much like, you do have a strong domestic system in Indonesia, but a lot of it is international as well. And obviously here in Hong Kong with Cathay and Hong Kong Airlines and the likes, I mean, they've got no place to go. So, I mean, they're not flying hardly at all. What happens? What do you see happening as far as the training requirements over the next 3 years? Are we back to normal and then we're back to the same old shortages? Or are we seeing real, as they would say, paradigm shifts in the industry where, okay, we're going from where we've got actually too many pilots now because so many have been furlonged. And it's now just a question of I have the pick of the fruit, if you will, because it's all sitting idle on the shelf, and I can go get the most qualified guy I want. And there's even less demand now, for guys coming through school. Or, some of the people we've talked to have said, look, to get an airline qualified pilot with his 1,500 hours, it takes 2 or 3 years. So actually, we expect things to return sort of back to normal in 2 or 3 years, and the demand will still be right back to where it was beforehand. So guys that want to come out of the system and be available 2 or 3 years now, they've got to start now. So a lot of the people we've talked to said, look, we don't really see a big difference. The demand is still going to be there in 2 or 3 years as everything returns back to normal. Now, is that the same in Indonesia? Is that the same in Asia Pacific? In your opinion,
would say it's less of the former. Yeah, I would say it's less of the former than the latter, because I agree with that statement very much that, the demand's still going to be there. But what I'm thinking is Indonesia and most of Southeast Asia, pretty much, in the past 20, 25 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the industry itself. For example, the Airline Deregulation Act of 1999 in Indonesia really opened doors for new players, new airlines to partake in the big cake. But that also it falls into a cycle where if you don't tackle from the regulatory side, as you mentioned, we all fall under the same structure of regulation, ICAO and FAAs, and so on and so forth. But it's actually essentially the same structure. But if you adapt too much into the fluctuations or the supply and demand of the industry, you will have a tendency to modify that regulation to satisfy the local demands. I see this happening as a cycle in Indonesia in the past 20 years, where we back then in the late 1990s, you wouldn't have a slightest chance of getting into any flying job, much less the airlines, if you at least don't have a multi-engine instrument commercial, whether it's from the FAA or local schools or whatnot. But then fast forward to 2007, 2008, up until after the global recession, those prerequisites seems to be not the case anymore, because airlines were recovering, demands were high, so they need to absorb as many fresh graduates as much as possible. I see this also impacts in Southeast Asia and also Asia Pacific, because we're running short. We'll ultimately run short in people, qualified people. And again, if we don't mitigate that, then it's going to be I would say workforce war once again, where people get hijacked from one airline to the other, and it's gonna end up as a tough situation for everyone, because then you're gonna run short in the end.
Right. So what we're saying is a good career path is still in aviation. We all feel that the demand and the requirements for certainly good qualified pilots with as much experience as possible will be needed. Okay. So kind of the last question then is, all right, then fine. So how do we attract people, particularly young talent, as we may or may not want to call it? How do we get them interested in the industry? Because I'm sure they look at it now and they just go, "You got to be kidding me! What? You want me to become a pilot? Are you nuts?" So, but as you say, we somehow have to put into their mind, well, we're not talking today. We're talking 2-3 years from now. So what should the industry be doing? And, there's a role obviously here for ASBA to play, but I'm sure there's also a role for some of the aviation bodies in Indonesia. But again, what do you think needs to be done, Ziva?
Yes, I still believe in the old-fashioned career path, as you mentioned. Some things you cannot change because it has been proved to be most effective, most optimum for many decades. And in the FAA, they've done some modifications in the late 2000s with the ATPL requirement, whereas ideally you would have 1,500 hours to qualify with the ground ATPL. Then you can apply for the regionals. But also if you have a military experience, that commensurates with less flying hour requirements, and it's also different if you have a bachelor's degree. But ultimately, the old ways of gaining experience, having a traditional way of career path, I think that still remains the most effective way of getting into the aviation workforce. And that I always emphasize that to prospective pilots, people who are pursuing or thinking about pursuing career in aviation, not just pilots, but engineers, flight operation officers, ATCs, and whatnot.
I know we always talk about pilots, but it's a whole bunch of other personnel with special skills that we need as well. So
exactly, and we've experienced that globally when the United Nations declared that they'll be needing 20,000 pilots within the next 10 years, which will be 2020, and it's as real as present as it gets. So, but it all comes down to talking to your local regulator. In Indonesia, we have DGCA, that you really need to have a consistency in how education, also recruitment process work, because you need to make space for that career to gradually increase, and before you make openings for the new guys. And then the argument goes down to, okay, where do the new fresh graduates start the career at? Well, same as the things have been done over in the US and Australia and other countries. You start with general aviation first, and you open opportunities to fly smaller planes. You gain the basic experience, gaining your hours. Maybe 2-3 years, you have your ATPL, and you have a chance of applying to the airlines or regional or charters. So I would still stress out the importance of that traditional method, Jeff.
And do you see then over the next couple of, as we sort of get our legs back, as you said, you're down to only seven training schools in Indonesia at the moment. It would seem, just by previous comments, that's just exacerbating a problem that exists as far as getting locally produced pilots into the system. Do you think we'll see some of the schools come back, or is it going to drive that young talent to look overseas to get their foot into the industry, either in the U.S. or, like I said, go to Australia? There are a lot of training schools in the U.S. with very creative programs, I would add, that even get you a work permit where, after going to school, you can stay, become an instructor, and build hours and build hours and build hours. And so do you think that's what we'll see? Will it be leaving the region but coming back hopefully? But is that going to be the trend also for this young talent, if you will?
I would say so, because the cost of getting into a pilot school in Indonesia, even before the pandemic, it had become too pricey, too expensive.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I would say from yeah, from the value for money standpoint, I'm not discrediting the local schools, but because of the lack of support from the regulators and the difficulty of getting your own training area, getting your planes up in the air from the airport against all the commercial slots, and the lack of instructor availability, those are some of the hurdles and challenges that were faced and are still faced by the local flying schools. So if you take dollar by dollar balance there, economically sound, it would be much more sensible to go overseas. Not even as far as to the U.S., but even in the region. I think Philippines offering more and more options now with a more fluid training package, and I believe Singapore and Seletar with the small flying clubs and flying schools have also opened recently. So there are many attractive options out there if you compare dollar to dollar, and you can complete those programs at a much more faster phase as opposed to getting your local training here. Of course, having your training done locally, it's much more comfortable because the environment, people speak the same language, but it doesn't really necessarily push you to get to know other environments of flying overseas, where you get pushed to communicate in foreign language and in English, and then you see how the ecosystem overseas are being done or operated.
I think I agree with you.
It's much more different.
There are a lot of what you may or may not call intangibles that are also big benefits by going overseas, or just to a different environment, as you say. Pilots tend to not serve just one market, as we're kind of alluding to. And most pilots aspire to not just fly domestically. They want to fly internationally as well, and fly bigger airplanes, longer missions. But getting out and getting a broader experience of the whole, if you will, aviation ecosystem can only serve you well at the end of the day. So, Ziva,
challenges is if I may add a little bit. The challenge would be to your remark before that about them coming back home, because once you get a taste of the fun in flying, and you see more opportunities of being able to work as an instructor, even though you're still on a non-permanent working permit, that kind of adds a little bit to how you measure your career path will be. Because I work with Embry-Riddle University also. Currently now there's approximately 12 Indonesian students getting their bachelor's and master's degree, and whom also work in the university as instructor or assistant professor and whatnot. So that kind of opens their horizon on, the possibility of career in aviation is much more than just being a pilot. And then they measure that up against the opportunity exists in their home country. Going back home may not be a more attractive option any longer. You know what I'm saying?
Again,
so getting those people home, go back here, it's tough.
Because I think a lot of those visas could then be used for applications to get green cards and stay in the U.S. permanently. So
absolutely.
Pros and cons. So. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. We want to keep these video clips short and to the point, which we've done.
Sure.
So we've succeeded in that matter. But I want to thank you again for taking the time today to get on and share your thoughts with us. It's been great. Thanks, Ziva.
Likewise, Jeffrey. Have a good one, and say hi to everyone at Asia Sky Group.